good thing that you took California by storm.
I don't know about it. When the storm cleared up, though, you bought all the property, eh?
Bing Crosby is dying, and Bob Hope isn't there. It's October 1977, and Crosby collapses on a golf course in Spain, a massive heart attack shutting down his body in seconds. News spreads fast. Hollywood royalty is gone. Within hours, tributes pour in from presidents, actors, musicians, and millions of fans who grew up watching the road pictures. But Hope, the man who spent 2 decades as Crosby's on-screen partner, the man who made 7 films with him, the man America believed was his closest friend, says almost nothing. No public statement, no tearful interview, just a few flat sentences released through a publicist. The silence is so loud that reporters notice, and in that silence lies a truth most people never understood. Bob Hope and Bing Crosby were never friends. They were business partners who despised each other, and the betrayal that ended whatever fragile bond they had didn't happen in 1977. It happened decades earlier, in a moment so cold and calculating that Crosby never forgave him. This is not a story about 2 legends who drifted apart. This is about 2 men who built an empire on fake chemistry, who smiled for the cameras while nursing grudges that festered for decades, and who each paid a price for pretending to be something they weren't. One of them died bitter. The other spent his final years haunted by the realization that he'd traded real connection for applause. And the thing that destroyed them wasn't ego. It wasn't competition. It was something far more personal and far more unforgivable. Stop here for a moment and consider what the public believed. Bob Hope and Bing Crosby were America's favorite comedy duo. The road pictures, Road to Singapore, Road to Morocco, Road to Bali, defined an entire era of Hollywood escapism. Their banter felt effortless. Their chemistry seemed genuine. Millions of people assumed they were best friends off-screen, too. That assumption was carefully constructed. It was also completely false. The truth is that from the very beginning, Crosby saw Hope as beneath him. Not just professionally, though Crosby was the bigger star when they first teamed up in 1940, but personally. Crosby came from a different world. He was a crooner, a smooth, laid-back performer who made everything look easy. Hope was a vaudeville hustler, a machine gun comic who clawed his way up from nothing. Crosby didn't respect that hustle. He saw it as desperation. Hope, for his part, resented Crosby's ease. Crosby didn't have to work as hard. He didn't have to perform for every person in the room. He could show up, do his bit, and leave. Hope couldn't do that. He needed the attention. He needed to be the funniest guy in the room, the most charming, the most indispensable. And Crosby's indifference to all of that, his ability to simply not care, drove Hope insane. So they worked together, made millions, and privately hated each other. But Hollywood marriages of convenience are nothing new. Plenty of on-screen partners have loathed each other and still made it work. What makes the Hope-Crosby relationship different is how deeply personal the betrayal became. And to understand that, you have to go back to the beginning. Not to when they met, but to who they were before they ever stood in front of a camera together. Bob Hope was born Leslie Towns Hope on May 29, 1903, in a cramped London suburb called Eltham. His father, William, was a stonemason who could barely keep the family fed. His mother, Avis, was a light opera singer who filled the house with music but couldn't fill it with money. There were 7 sons, and they lived on top of each other in a space too small for that many bodies and that much hunger. In 1907, William left for America. He went alone, settling in Cleveland, Ohio, where his brothers worked as plumbers and steam fitters. It took him a year to scrape together enough money to send for the rest of the family. When they finally boarded the SS Philadelphia in 1908, they traveled in steerage, the lowest class, packed in with immigrants fleeing poverty just like them. When they arrived at Ellis Island, an immigration officer made a mistake. He recorded Bob's age as 2 instead of 4. That error followed Hope for years on official documents, a small reminder that even his identity had been mishandled from the start. In Cleveland, life didn't get easier. The family crammed into a tiny house near Doan's Corners and took in boarders to make rent. Avis worked constantly. William worked when he could find jobs. The boys grew up understanding one thing: survival required hustle. Hope learned early that the best way to survive was to make people laugh. If you could entertain, you could eat. If you could charm, you could get ahead. He entered a Charlie Chaplin look-alike contest when he was 10 and won. The applause felt better than anything else in his life. It felt like control. By his teens, he was trying everything: boxing under the name Packy East, selling newspapers, working as a soda jerk, hustling pool. He paid attention to people. He studied how they talked, what made them laugh, what they wanted to hear. He wasn't naturally funny. He was strategically funny, and that made all the difference. Vaudeville became his training ground. He partnered with dancers, refined his timing, learned to read a room in seconds. Most comedians of that era relied on prepared routines. Hope developed something else: spontaneity, or at least the appearance of it. He made audiences feel like he was talking directly to them, like they were in on the joke. It was a con, but a brilliant one. By the 1930s, he'd clawed his way to radio. His big break came with The Pepsodent Show in 1938, a weekly program that turned him into a household name. His style was different from other radio stars. He didn't play a character, he played himself, or a version of himself. He joked about real events, current headlines, his own failures. It felt fresh, immediate, dangerous in a harmless way. What people didn't see was the machinery behind it. Hope employed a team of writers who churned out hundreds of jokes a week. He'd pick the best ones, deliver them with perfect timing, and take all the credit. He wasn't a genius. He was a ruthless editor with impeccable instincts, and that was enough to make him one of the biggest stars in America. But radio wasn't enough. Hope wanted movies, and that's where Bing Crosby comes in. Bing Crosby was born Harry Lillis Crosby Jr. on May 3, 1903, in Tacoma, Washington. Unlike Hope, Crosby didn't grow up desperate. His father was a bookkeeper. His mother was a devout Catholic. The family wasn't rich, but they were stable, respectable, middle class. Crosby went to Gonzaga University. He sang in local bands for fun, not survival. His rise to fame was almost accidental. He had a good voice, a relaxed style, and the kind of effortless charm that can't be taught. By the early 1930s, he was a national sensation. His recordings sold millions. His radio show dominated the airwaves. When he transitioned to film, he became one of Hollywood's biggest stars almost immediately. Crosby didn't hustle. He didn't have to. Things came to him. And when Paramount Pictures decided to make Road to Singapore in 1940, Crosby was the obvious choice for the male lead. The studio wanted a buddy comedy, something light and escapist. They tried to cast Fred MacMurray and Jack Oakey. They passed. They tried George Burns and Gracie Allen. They passed. Finally, they turned to Crosby and paired him with Bob Hope. Hope was thrilled. This was his chance to break into movies in a big way. Crosby was less enthusiastic. He saw Hope as a comedian, not a co-star, someone who could handle the punchlines while Crosby handled the songs and the romance. He wasn't wrong exactly. That was the dynamic Paramount wanted. But Hope had other plans. From the first day of shooting, Hope refused to stay in his lane. He ad-libbed, he improvised, he threw in jokes that weren't in the script. Crosby, who preferred to stick to the plan and get out early, was annoyed. But the director, Victor Schertzinger, loved it. The improvisation gave the film energy, made it feel spontaneous. Nearly half the dialogue in Road to Singapore wasn't scripted. It was two comedians competing in real time. The film was a hit. Audiences loved the banter, the chemistry, the sense that anything could happen. Paramount immediately greenlit a sequel, then another, then another. Over the next 22 years, Hope and Crosby made 7 road pictures together. They became one of the most iconic duos in Hollywood history. But behind the scenes, the relationship was poison. Crosby resented Hope's need to dominate every scene. He later called him a talentless hack in private conversations, a label that cut deep because it contained a grain of truth. Hope wasn't naturally gifted the way Crosby was. Hope worked for every laugh, and Crosby, who never had to work that hard, couldn't respect it. Hope, meanwhile, resented Crosby's indifference. Crosby didn't socialize. He didn't attend industry events unless contractually required. He didn't play the Hollywood game. After filming Wrapped each day, Crosby would sit alone reading horse racing results or studying the stock market. Hope would be working the room, schmoozing with producers, planning his next move. To Crosby, that looked like insecurity. To Hope, Crosby's aloofness looked like arrogance. Their wives never socialized, not once. Dolores Hope and Catherine Crosby moved in completely different circles. When Hope was honored at a Friars Club roast, an event where Hollywood's elite gathered to celebrate one of their own, Crosby didn't show up. He was on the board of the Friars Club. His absence was noticed. When asked why he skipped it, Crosby shrugged and said, "I wasn't hungry." Money made things worse. On the early road pictures, Crosby earned nearly twice what Hope did. Crosby was the bigger star, so Paramount justified the pay gap, but Hope hated it. By 1947, he'd renegotiated his contract and started earning the same as Crosby. Even then, the resentment lingered. Hope kept score. Crosby didn't care, and that indifference was its own form of cruelty. But none of this would have ended the relationship. Plenty of co-stars have hated each other and still maintained a professional friendship for decades. What destroyed Hope and Crosby wasn't ego or money or billing order. It was something far more personal. It was a betrayal that Crosby never forgave. Here's what happened. In the early 1950s, Crosby's first wife, Dixie Lee, was dying. She'd been an alcoholic for years and her body was failing. Crosby was devastated. Despite his public image as the calm, unflappable crooner, he loved Dixie deeply. Her decline was slow, painful, and humiliating. Crosby became intensely private about it. He didn't want the press involved. He didn't want Hollywood gossip. He wanted to grieve in peace. Hope knew this. Everyone in their circle knew this. But Hope also had a radio show to produce, and he needed material. His writers were always hungry for fresh jokes, and nothing was off limits. One week, they wrote a bit about Crosby's personal life, something that alluded to Dixie's condition. It wasn't vicious, it was just a throwaway line, but it crossed a boundary. Hope saw the joke in rehearsal. He could have cut it. He didn't. He let it air. Crosby heard it. So did everyone else. The joke made it into the press. Columnists picked it up. Suddenly, Dixie's private suffering was public fodder. Crosby was furious. He called Hope directly and told him exactly what he thought. According to people close to both men, Crosby's exact words were, "You're dead to me." Hope tried to apologize. He claimed he didn't realize the joke would be taken that way. He said it was the writers, not him. But Crosby didn't buy it. Hope had final approval on every word that went on the air. He could have stopped it. He chose not to. And that choice told Crosby everything he needed to know about who Bob Hope really was. From that point on, their relationship was purely transactional. They still made road pictures together because the studio demanded it, and the money was too good to walk away from. But the pretense of friendship was over. Crosby wouldn't take Hope's calls. He wouldn't attend his events. When they worked together, Crosby was coldly professional. He did his scenes, collected his check, and left. Hope, for his part, never fully understood why Crosby wouldn't forgive him. In his mind, it was just a joke. It was what comedians did. They pushed boundaries. They made light of dark things. That was the job. But Crosby didn't see it that way. To Crosby, Hope had chosen a punchline over loyalty. And loyalty, in Crosby's world, was everything. The final road picture, The Road to Hong Kong, was released in 1962. By then, the formula was tired. Audiences had moved on. Hope and Crosby went through the motions, but the spark was gone. When filming wrapped, they barely said goodbye. 15 years later, Crosby died on that golf course in Spain. Hope's muted response shocked people who assumed they were lifelong friends. But those close to both men weren't surprised. Hope had burned that bridge decades earlier, and Crosby had made sure it stayed burned. In his later years, Hope rarely spoke about Crosby. When he did, it was always in vague, complimentary terms. A great talent, a true professional. But he never called him a friend. Because they weren't. They were two men who built a fortune pretending to like each other, and when the cameras turned off, the pretense ended. Here's the part that haunts the story. Hope lived another 26 years after Crosby died. He reached 100 years old. He performed for presidents, received countless honors, and was celebrated as one of the greatest entertainers in American history. But near the end, when dementia began to take hold and his mind wandered back through the decades, the people around him noticed something. He talked about Crosby. Not with anger, with regret. He couldn't remember why they'd stopped being friends. He couldn't remember the joke, the fight, the betrayal. All he knew was that something had gone wrong, and he'd lost someone important. His wife Dolores would gently remind him that he and Crosby were never really friends, but Hope didn't believe her. In his failing memory, they were. And that false memory was kinder than the truth. Crosby, meanwhile, took the grudge to his grave. He never softened, he never forgave. And when he died, he left behind a clear message to those who knew. Bob Hope was not welcome at the funeral, and his name was not to be mentioned in eulogies. The cruelest irony is that the public never knew. To this day, when people think of Bob Hope and Bing Crosby, they think of the road pictures. They think of two comedians who made each other funnier. They think of friendship. And in a way, that's the final joke. The two men who built their careers on fake chemistry managed to fool everyone, except each other. Hope died in 2003 at the age of 100. When the tributes poured in, almost every obituary mentioned his partnership with Crosby. The road pictures were listed as one of his greatest achievements, and they were, but they were also a lie. A profitable, beloved, enduring lie. The real story wasn't about two legends who conquered Hollywood together. It was about two men who needed each other's success more than they needed each other's respect. And when one of them crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, the partnership became a prison. They kept performing. They kept smiling. But the friendship, if it ever existed, was gone. In the end, Bob Hope got everything he wanted. Fame, wealth, legacy, a place in history. But the one thing he couldn't buy, couldn't perform his way into, was the forgiveness of the man who knew him best. And that absence, that cold silence from Bing Crosby, followed him all the way to the end. If you want to understand the cost of fame, don't look at the failures. Look at the men who succeeded. Look at what they sacrificed to stay on top. And ask yourself, what would you give up for applause? Because Bob Hope gave up everything, including the only friendship that might have mattered.